My name is Richard Cook. I'm the author of this new book, We Hold These Truths, The Hope of Monetary Reform. Welcome back to this 6-part video, Credit as a Public Utility, the Solution to the Economic Crisis. In Part 5, we will examine the underlying reason the banks have become so powerful in the industrial era. The title of Part 5 is The Gap Between Prices and Income. We live in the industrial age, where the world has been transformed by technology. Such forces as steam power, the harnessing of electricity, the internal combustion engine, nuclear energy, electronic communications, and information technology have been transformed by the mind of man into social assets. The Western convention of private ownership of the means of production has long tended to bestow the benefits of innovation more on owners than on workers and employees. But workers and owners alike work under the domination of the financiers who control the money supply. Of course, systems of taxation, public welfare, regulation, cooperatives, and various degrees of public or state ownership have been implemented at times, sometimes through battles at the ballot box, or even revolution. This has ensured at least some degree of sharing by the general population in the bounty of the industrial age, apart from just being consumers. But one particular trend has not been solved. It has taken fewer and fewer workers to produce more and more products. Some say that in the next 20 or 30 years, half the existing jobs in the U.S. economy may no longer be needed. Even in war, robots are starting to replace soldiers. Economic theory has dealt extremely poorly with the fact that the more efficient industrial production becomes, the harder it is for workers to keep pace with the cost of living, since our income depends on our employment. Collectively, as the need for workers decreases, there is insufficient purchasing power within the economic system to pay for everything that can be manufactured. One result is that nations tend to look abroad for customers to buy their products, but this makes each nation the competitor of every other. Wars have resulted. Global capitalism and free trade remove trade barriers, but this puts even more pressure on national economies that are unable to provide a secure living for their populations when jobs are outsourced to nations where labor or resources are cheaper. So during the industrial age, the population of every nation, including the wealthier ones, sooner or later ends up in danger of that condition described as poverty in the midst of plenty. This was the case during the Great Depression. That experience has been repeated with every recession since then, and it is taking place as the recession of 2008-2009 gets worse. This is another reminder of the ill effects when bubbles and their collapse result from control of the money supply by the private banking system. Even though some nations, especially those of Western Europe, have created social welfare systems or have strong labor movements that cushion the blow of insufficient worker income, when the economies of all nations simultaneously decline, there is no solution under the existing paradigm. Economists and politicians call for jobs and more jobs. But why do we need more workers when there are not enough earnings within the economy to consume what is already being produced? We are in the presence of a mystery. Why haven't modern science and technology brought peace, prosperity, and happiness? Certainly technological change leads to change in the workplace, but it shouldn't be out of reach for businesses and society to adapt to change, though no one seems to do it very successfully. Is it then a matter of correcting a condition of economic injustice, giving workers a larger piece of the economic pie, or is something even deeper at work? For what really seems to be needed is more purchasing power to buy what the economy is capable of producing. Otherwise, we simply should produce less and purchase less. The one thing we know for sure is that the basic idea of classical economics, namely, that there is an invisible hand that always causes the free and unregulated marketplace to ensure the greatest benefit to all, if simply left alone, is dead wrong. Unless we adopt the belief, which some still seem to do, that poverty for many is a condition we really can't or shouldn't do anything about. But no one with any degree of sensitivity can accept that belief. Two of the greatest thinkers in the history of economics tried to discover what the factor might be that defeats the invisible hand theory. What they found is that there is a persistent gap between the prices that are charged for goods and services and the income available within the economy to purchase them. One of these thinkers was British economist John Maynard Keynes, one of the most famous men of the 20th century, author of the general theory of employment, interest, and money, and the father of what is still called Keynesian economics. The other was a man few Americans have heard of, Major C.H. Douglas, a British engineer who published the book Economic Democracy in 1920 and spent the rest of his life promoting his ideas about what he called a national dividend. Douglas was much better known elsewhere in the world, and his ideas became the basis of the social credit movement that still exists in Great Britain and the British Commonwealth nations. The Great Depression struck in 1929 when the stock market crashed. But the bubble economy of the Roaring Twenties had concealed a condition where a gap occurred between A, the prices being charged for goods and services, and B, income in the hands of the public to purchase them. After the crash, factories began to shut down. Farmers were killing their livestock or pouring their milk in the fields because people did not have enough money to purchase things. Men were willing and able to work, even as factories were closing their doors. But the money that was needed for the system to function was not available. One of the causes of the price-income gap, which both Keynes and Douglas identified, was that businesses need to charge enough for their products in order for them to save a certain amount of money for future investments. This is known in economics as retained earnings. In addition, individuals, including the owners who receive income as dividends, also save for the future. Both retained earnings and individual savings are deposited in banks, where the money tends to be tied up in lending for the purchase of assets or for speculation, not as immediate individual income. Additionally, Douglas, though not Keynes, pointed out that when businesses pay back loans they owe to banks, the money they pay also has to be included in prices. Also, in more recent years, a certain portion of business earnings goes for various types of insurance, including employee health insurance, which insurance companies invest, and for employer contributions to retirement savings. These are another form of savings. Yet another process today removes funds from the income stream. This is through taxes levied by federal, state, and local governments that are invested in various types of trust funds or contingency accounts. These are known as CAFR funds, after the type of off-budget financial reporting practiced in the U.S. and reported in comprehensive annual financial reports. Altogether, the 50 states are reported as holding over $600 billion in CAFR funds. So, there are a variety of ways that earnings from the production of goods and services do not circulate within the everyday consuming economy. The tendency for this money to be hoarded and abused by the financial capitalists who oversee deposit accounts and investment funds had already been seen by Thomas Jefferson at the start of the Industrial Revolution. He wrote to George Washington in 1792, "All the capital employed in paper speculation is barren and useless, producing, like that on a gaming table, no accession to itself, and is withdrawn from commerce and agriculture, where it could have produced addition to the common mass." Jefferson was a genius we ignore at our peril. He anticipated Keynes and Douglas by pointing out the potential for unused capital to contribute to economic productivity, though he did not at the time propose a remedy, except in a general sense to limit the powers of the banks which held such funds. For all these reasons, total prices in an industrial economy are always greater in any given accounting cycle than total income. The difference may be substantial. My own estimate is that today at least 25% of total prices fall into this category, a figure also found in the social credit literature. It's the difference between a nation's GDP, which measures prices, and its net income. The figure also takes into account our large negative trade balance. Note that the gap is not caused by disparities of income among owners, executives, managers, and workers. Though these disparities may be a cause for concern, the gap is a structural issue that would still exist even if earnings and wealth were identical among individuals and social classes. The solution Keynes proposed has always been difficult for economic conservatives to accept. This was to use government deficit spending in order to regain use of the saved money for the economy at large. That happens when the government borrows from these savers by selling them bonds to finance government programs. Alternatively, a way to commandeer these savings under law is through taxation. Both deficit spending and heavy taxation were used by the Roosevelt administration during the 1930s when the government began to run up the national debt to spur recovery. During World War II, income tax rates were raised to the highest levels in history. The Roosevelt administration also took over some of the control of credit from the banks and accelerated demand through low-interest lending coordinated by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and the Homeowners Loan Corporation. To a significant degree, Roosevelt and his successors used Keynesian economics to limit the control of the financiers over the price-income gap and monetize the gap for economic growth. Again, the government turned the gap into usable cash through deficit spending. But Keynesian economics creates problems of its own, which have prevented it from ever offering a complete solution. In fact, Keynesian economics has helped cause today's crisis by leading to the massive debt overload on the government and the economy. One problem is that both governments and individuals have to pay interest on their borrowing. The U.S. government today spends $500 billion annually on interest. Individuals, businesses, and state and local governments probably spend another $2 trillion. Another problem is that the economy of any nation that practices Keynesian economics constantly has to grow in order to stay one step ahead of its debt. This produces the kind of system we know as the rat race, with everyone having to produce more and more just to stay abreast. Also, resource consumption, rampant consumerism, and pollution tend to get out of control and produce more costs. Then these higher costs show up in upward pressure on prices of goods and services. But a vicious circle results when price pressure leads to reduction in product quality. Perhaps one of the worst examples is reduction of short-term food production costs by use of genetically modified seeds. Such travesties are side effects of the debt-based monetary system. Thus, Keynesian economics produces a downward spiral, especially for mature, low-growth economies like that of the U.S. Today, government spending is again becoming the chief economic engine for the U.S., especially with the new Obama budget that projects a deficit for fiscal year 2009 of $1.75 trillion, a colossal figure. One way for the government to spend in order to fill the price-income gap has been through military expenditures. So Keynesian economics also goes hand in hand with warfare and the creation and maintenance of the permanent military-industrial complex President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned us about. The government tries to overcome the debt produced by Keynesian economics by inflating the currency, so it can pay its debt in dollars of decreasing value. Inflation also increases tax rates by pushing taxpayers into higher income brackets and, at the local level, driving up real estate assessments. Finally, again, because aggregate worker income remains insufficient under a Keynesian system, the portion of the price-income gap the government can't fill by borrowing or taxation is met by the private banking industry, which today finances much of worker consumption, not just business purposes. In 2006, the GDP was $13 trillion, and national income $9.2 trillion, a difference of $3.8 trillion. The gap was largely filled by consumers borrowing from the banks to make up for their income shortfall. In fact, our economy, supposedly the richest in the world, is dependent on bank lending just so many people can buy the necessities of life. So in the end, Keynesian economics was in reality a huge compromise that allowed the banking industry to remain in charge of the economy and continue to be vastly profitable. Around 1970, President Richard Nixon made the famous statement, "We are all Keynesians now." In 2009, we still are. And working together through Keynesian economics, the government and the financiers have created the biggest debt fiasco in history. Let's look now at C.H. Douglas's proposed solution. He too identified the gap between prices and worker income as the key problem of industrial economics. He saw the gap as inevitable because of the need for retained earnings and savings, but he also saw the economic system as growing in productivity over time. Thus, the economy is appreciating in value, even though depreciation of current physical plant and resources has to be compensated for. The fact that this longer-term appreciation is occurring shows up eventually when assets are sold and capital gains realized. This is why, despite its ups and downs, the worth of the stock market tends to increase over long periods of time. Douglas thus viewed the economic system as growing in worth and vitality. He saw life through the eyes of an engineer, not an economist, which meant that the world to Douglas was one of abundance, rooted in the infinite energy and creativity of man and nature. To most economists, by contrast, the world is viewed as one of scarcity and of working harder and harder to outrace poverty and depletion. Douglas invented what I call dividend economics. He said that retained earnings, savings, and investment should be monetized in the present, not by government or consumer debt, but by paying every member of society a cash dividend against future productivity gains, which those earnings, savings, and investments had been set aside to achieve. The benefit Douglas advocated had two parts. One was called the national dividend. The second was price subsidies he called the compensated price. Under a national dividend system, each citizen would receive periodic cash payments as their fair share of the productive economy that modern industrial methods generate. A central board and research bureau would oversee the system. The national dividend would not derive from government debt or taxation. Instead, it would come from a dividend account maintained by the Treasury, where money would be generated in a similar way to the banks making loans out of thin air, except now the government would give a certain amount of credit to the people rather than the banks lending to them. The amount would depend on estimates of future economic production. It would be government-directed credit managed as a public utility, and credit that did not have to be repaid, but would feed into the production system. A much more fair and stable economic system would result. Because the dividend would be used by individuals for purchases, it would generate new economic activity and would replace much of the borrowing from banks for consumption. Thus it would be non-inflationary. Combined with laws against bank speculation, a national dividend system would restore the banking system to its proper and more restricted role of providing worker capital or liquidity for day-to-day business operations, as well as for business innovation and expansion. Douglas's ideas spread rapidly during the 1930s as the world suffered through the Great Depression. The social credit movement became a political force in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, along with Great Britain. Douglas's ideas were studied seriously in Italy and Japan. While a pure social credit system was never implemented, the ideas of an abundant world and the right of all citizens to share in it became a positive force for change in many countries. But by the end of World War II, the world financial system was based on Keynesian economics and the continued excessive use of bank credit. Today, the bankers rule the world, especially after the decision was made around 1970 to start shifting the U.S. economy from industrial production to finance. This decision was made largely by the leaders of international banking, working through prominent public figures in the U.S. national security, diplomatic, and financial arenas. President Richard Nixon's opening to China opened the door for huge amounts of manufacturing to be shifted by U.S. corporations to low-paid workers in that country. China and other nations now support our trade and fiscal deficits by selling us their manufactured goods and using the dollars they earn to buy Treasury bonds and as dollar reserves. But the weakness of this position is blatant. The time has come when we are no longer able to rely safely on other nations to finance our standard of living by purchasing our debt. Our dependence on China for our financial existence is recognized today as a major security threat, and the Chinese themselves are seeking alternatives to this system. This is all another effect of Keynesian economics and the debt-based monetary system. We are now nearing the end of this video series. Next we will have the final segment, where I will talk about why I believe conversion to a greenback monetary system, along with dividend economics, which we have just been talking about, would give us the new monetary and credit system we need. We can take these steps by seeing credit as the public utility it truly is. Thank you for watching.